All right, it is now time for the final lecture of this section, and we're going to look fairly briefly at Japan, stuff that we didn't get to fit into the last lecture. So to begin with, Japan was set up during this time as a feudal system. If you remember back to what Ms. Custer taught you, if you were here for 8th grade, the feudal system is a system where you have the ruler who owns everything. And then that person gives part of his ownings, particularly land, to people who are under him, who then owe him some sort of thing in return. Usually, they owe him military service. So if I give one of my most favorite people a quarter of my country, then he owes me, say, 500 knights for 2 months of the year. And so I'll choose my 4 favorite people, I'll give them land, they each owe me 500 knights, and they will then give that land to maybe 30 of their favorite people. Each of them owes them about 12 knights or so. They then give it out to, each of those people give it out to 12 knights, who then give it out to their serfs. Then the serfs give grain, the knights give service, and it goes all the way back up to the ruler. In Japan, they had a very similar situation. So the person at the top was the emperor. And he was the one who, in theory, ruled all of Japan. But as it turns out, for a lot of the time period when what we're looking at happens, the emperor was so amazing and so magnificent that he didn't get his hands dirty in common day-to-day things. He was simply there. He's the one who made the people under him have the authority to rule. And in Japan, the people under him were the shogun. And the shogun was the one who actually really did the ruling. And the shogun then is the one who has the land, who gives it out to the people underneath him, and he would give it out then to his daimyo. And let me check what you guys have on your notes. Okay, so you have 3 daimyo. Now in real life, the shogun might have a dozen, might have 20, might have 3, who knows? It changed with each one, but because your paper isn't so big, we're going to stick with 3. So each of these daimyo then were given a portion of the country to rule as their own. They still had to report back to the shogun. Under them, they would then give out their land, because it's still too much for one person to handle, to people that we call samurai. And each daimyo might have 10 or a dozen or 15 samurai. So we'll just write a whole bunch of them. And this guy has those, this guy has those, this guy has those. Obviously, this is just a model, but the idea is that he has the land, he splits it up between a few of his biggest people, they split it up between their trusted people. Then these people, when he calls for them, have to give him military service. When he calls them, they have to give him military service, usually with these guys. And then under the samurai were the people, the ordinary people, like what all of you would actually be, even though you may dream of being a samurai. You're probably not going to be. You're going to be a farmer, you're going to be a fisherman, you're going to be someone who work in the land, paying your samurai a portion of your crop. So this would be then the situation in feudal Japan. Now it's interesting, if you can think back to when you studied Europe, these guys would be the knights. That's pretty obvious. So they are the knights. They're the ones who have the smallest amount of land. In Europe, under the knights would be the serfs. These would be the barons. The earls, the counts, the dukes, the whatever you call them, those are the guys who are right under the king. This would be the king. Now, if you think about the way that the Europeans did things, who is it that is above the king in theory, doesn't actually get too much involved in the day-to-day running of the countries, but is the one who says to the king, you have the authority. Okay, last year you might have heard of the word the divine right of kings. Well, in Japan, the emperor had sort of the same position that God did during the European Middle Ages. And so the emperor gives the authority to the shogun to rule. The shogun divides his land among the daimyo divide his land among the samurai, and each of them owes the person above them a certain service. So the shogun owes the emperor loyalty, Confucian respect, etc., just like the king owes God his worship and praise and whatever it may be. Now, obviously, in Europe, that wasn't a tight bond. We'll just put it that way. Come out for my medieval history class sometime and we'll talk about it. All right. So, how did the Japanese react to the Europeans? So we saw how the Chinese reacted. They basically looked at the European stuff and said, that's not Chinese. We have no need for it. Unless it's money. We'll take your money. So what did the Japanese do? So, reaction to the Europeans. So originally, the Japanese saw these Europeans and said, whoa, they're different. They're kind of cool. Let's see what they have. So they were originally accepted. And in particular, what the Japanese really liked was the technology. The Japanese said, whoa, these Europeans have some really cool stuff. We could copy that. We could make it better. We could make it work way much better, and 500 years from now, we'll sell it back to them. Okay, so they loved the European technology. The Europeans, they were a different matter. So eventually, the Europeans became odious. Eventually, the Europeans became annoying. So they looked at the Europeans and they said, you know what, you're bringing in stuff that we really aren't too keen on. We love your guns, yes. We love your ships that can go across the ocean. We love the things that you're bringing us technologically. But you yourselves, we're not too happy about that. We don't like this Christianity stuff you're bringing in. Because in Christianity, you don't worship the emperor. That's a bad thing. That throws off our whole system here if the emperor isn't at the top. And you're bringing ideas that from your culture that don't match our Confucian Buddhist culture. And so eventually, I think this is your third dot, they limited the outsiders. One port. So this is the only place you can come. We're not going to have you corrupting our whole country. We'll put this little area aside. Everyone will know, ooh, these nasty foreigners come here. Don't pay too much attention to them. Take their stuff. We love the tech. But the people, they can just stay there and we won't bother them. So the only people who could come were the Chinese, so after all, you have to admit everyone likes Chinese stuff, and the Dutch. Because the Dutch were the sort of traders that were like, yeah, whatever you want us to do, we'll do it. We're not going to bring anything. If you don't want to learn about the way we do things, fine with us. We're just here to make money. And so they were pretty okay with most of the Asian countries because the Dutch were just simply there for the money. They didn't try to convert anyone. They didn't try to make them buy tulips or whatever it may be. They were just like, yeah, let's trade and be done with it. So what you end up having then is Japan and how it reacts to this European influence versus China, how it reacts. So this is at the bottom of your page. I don't think you have anything down here. But basically China, it looks at Europeans and European things and says, we don't need you. We are good enough to handle things on our own. Japan, on the other hand, says, yeah, we don't need you. But we like your technology. And as we'll see later on, actually we won't because we're not going to talk about this later, but later on Japan, especially at the end of the 1800s, looked to the other countries to the west, to Europe, and said, wow, we really could make the stuff they have even better. And so Japan would take the technology and make it Japanese. And it's interesting, this sort of scenario is still going on to a large extent today. Although China has realized, yeah, there's a lot of money to be made by opening ourselves up and trying to see if we can sell as much as possible to the rest of the world.